You've just entered the Disaster Tough podcast, the place for emergency managers, first responders, and humanitarians who want to get the job done. Stories, lessons, and tips are provided by field experts. I'm your host, John Scardena, owner of Doberman Emergency Management and former federal emergency response official who's responded to some of the most extreme disasters. Disaster Tough is our mantra. It combines experience, training, and analytics in order to be successful at any stage within the disaster lifecycle. It means being a professional in emergency and disaster services. Doberman Emergency Management lives by this. If your organization needs to fill a gap, please contact us. We can help. Contact info is in the show notes. We also support other products and organizations that will increase your ability. For example, if you fight wildfires, hurricanes, a pandemic, any disaster in the field, at a hospital or command center, listen up. You're missing out if you do not use L3 Harris for your radio comms. They are secure, portable, mobile, and scalable, which is great news for us in the field. A truly disaster-tough radio system. Check out the XL family of radios by clicking on the show notes or simply go to l3harris.com. When you think of situational awareness, you need to think of Futurity IT. They are disaster tough because they saw a gap and figured out how to close it by creating the Orion and Athena applications. Situational awareness is all about speed, coordination, and accuracy of information. Futurity IT's Orion app collects and provides preliminary damage assessments and integrates all incident action plan documents with WebEOC. The Athena app allows for planning, contact tracing, and customizable group coordination in every single phase of the disaster lifecycle. The best part? Futurity IT made both applications extremely intuitive. It's so easy to use. Click on the show notes today to schedule a free demo.
Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardena. I have been trying to get this guy on the show for like a year now. He was one of my professors at Georgetown University. He's with Cranfield University, so you can talk about that kind of relationship and how that works there. But as you guys have heard several times, because I've had a lot of my cohort on here, it was my master's program, and we really focused on the theory and application of emergency and disaster management. Dr. Stephen Johnson, who I call Steve, is truly an expert in CBRNe, specifically related to chemical and biological events. And he really taught me that foundation of that understanding of how that interacts within our global community. And he can speak to a lot of the in-depth things there. We've been in this whole year in a pandemic, and we can talk about that as well. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hey there, John. Really good to talk to you.
I'm really excited for this because I've had probably half the cohort on this show over the year. And I would say that almost every single person, one of the first things they say after the show is, "Why haven't you had Steve on here yet? Why haven't you had Steve?" I'm like, well, funny enough, I've been trying to get him on here. So, hey, thank you so much for making time. I know you're extremely busy, and I really appreciate it.
No worries at all. I'm sure you say that to all of your faculty.
Yes, I do. All the 0 faculty I've had on here. So there's a reason, too. Like, you really are a fan favorite. You were both a fan favorite in our program. And I'm not talking you up. I mean, there was an understanding in our program that you're both an expert in your field, but you're also a practitioner in your field. And all of our professors kind of had that, but you were able to at least not just the persona, but really show us why, in depthly of like why that's important and multitask there. And so before we get into like really anything, can you just talk to me about what it means to become a true expert in the field and what it takes to do that?
Sure. Well, I mean, start with a hard question. I think the first thing I'd probably take issue with, which I guess everyone would, is the whole concept of the expert. It shouldn't be a static thing. You never stop learning. Every time you sort of allow your concepts and your precepts to fix, you stagnate and you die. So I think if I looked at anything that had helped me get to where I am now, it's probably the fact that I've always had a little bit of imposter syndrome. And so I've always wanted to listen to other people because I'm sure that they know more than me. And the more you listen and the more that you sort of network and communicate, actually you find that sometimes some of the best things you can do, some of the best expertise is linking people, linking them to data, to other people, to resources. And so in a strange way, that expertise isn't necessarily about some phenomenal academic research. And, there are people who are far, far better at me in terms of their research output, but about actually identifying the problems and connecting people with the solutions, which is, it's lovely to see that that's something that you've gone into heavily yourself as well.
Well, I think the trick is, so between you and Rodney Melsick, who's been on the show, somebody I definitely can't claim as one of my mentors. He's actually with me at Doberman. He is a legend. And, when I first met him, he's an interesting guy, right? Like, he's not an A-type personality. And it really shocked me at the time. Before I was learned, if you can say that, I was like, who is this guy? And then he started working. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, this is why. He is a legend because he's the best. He really is the best. And he's been doing it forever. But the thing that got me about him was his ability to keep learning. Many, our field is driven by A-type personalities for a good reason. We want to get the job done. But it's also a major hindrance because as soon as we all get bullheaded, we think our way is the right way. You're right, like, it's stagnant. And like Rodney would say, like, no, we're going to get the job done, but like there's more out here. And he would be learning at a faster rate than anybody else. And I think it only perpetuated the more he knew. The more he knew, the more he knew where he didn't know. He knew what he didn't know, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely does. I mean, I have to say, his lecture to the program still is probably one of my favorite talks from anyone. Although my focus has always been about counterterrorism, and his talk was mainly about emergency management. Those principles that he gave you as a class in terms of what things you can take forward as ways to approach your job. They were just incredible, timeless, and also, a phenomenal speaking style for anyone who ever had the chance to speak to him. He just walked around the class, just engaging with people. And the thing that hit me more than anything else is that he did that classic thing that you see with great leaders. He asks a bit about you, which is a connection. So, where are you from? I've been there. Yeah, that's really interesting. And before you know it, although, like you say, not a classic alpha type, I call him a stealth alpha, because he kind of gets you following him, but you don't really realize he's doing it to you.
Amazing.
And again, I think that folds back to the key aspect of expertise is if you can get people engaging for you, working for you, and wanting you to succeed, then that's half the battle. Because if you're having to try and pull information all the time and constantly having to work to get that information, that limits you. Whereas if you can do the Rodney trick of just getting everyone to want to help you, then it's half the battle.
Okay, real talk. If we have another discussion about what leadership is, I might die inside. I've had so many, like between my master's and my undergrad, and talk about trying to become an expert. Like, I don't care to become an expert in leadership anymore. Like, I'm so tired. Oh, there's so many different types of leadership. You look at Rodney Melsick, you look at Steve Johnson, you look at some of these other real leaders, and I think it's really easy. I think it might be hard actually to identify what a leader is until you see someone who's not a leader.
Yeah,
and it's like, obvious. Oh, don't do that. Like X, Y, and Z. Like, don't do that. Like, hard talk. So, like in that same vein though, with Rodney, one thing he does is he's able to not just connect with a person, but he's able to make a personal connection. I asked him, how is it that you're able to remember names so easily? And he's like, I love movies. So when I see a person, I see the movie. If I meet, Steve, I'm going to associate it with Steve Jobs, the movie, right? And so he's able to go through, and that's how he visualizes the room. And I've never seen anybody so well just like remember details about people, especially their name. And then when you call people by their name, it makes them like, it makes them feel important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So Steve,
sorry, I've fast. Good working. I've kind of diverted you there off of the CBRN topic, which
no, it's fine.
That's probably synonymous with CBRN. As the moment people look at CBRN, they try and find something not CBRN to talk about on it, because no one wants to talk about actual CBRN. So it becomes, no, this is a management challenge or a leadership challenge, or
hilarious.
This is just health.
Okay, so let's talk about it then, because I actually really I had oh my gosh, Jack. I had William Jackson on here who did kind of some of that stuff in when he was in the military, and she talked about it briefly. But I've been kind of saving this stuff because I do have a lot of questions and thought processes myself, and I think a lot of other people are becoming aware that, like, when we say CBRNE, like chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear explosives, for those who don't know the acronym, people think doomsday.
Hmm.
And they don't realize that it's used on individual basis. You know, it's used all the time in warfare, in psychological warfare even. You do one small incident turns into something big. And it reminded me of thinking about this. I always forget it, so I have to write it down. I'm going to think I'm the worst student ever. Pulling up my notes here. Explosion de la Machine Infernale. If I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
All right. Hey.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Yeah, my super old picture to show you all about nothing changing.
I love it. It's one of the classes that I actually like verbatim can remember where I was sitting right when you were presenting this and you showed that picture, because like it changed the trajectory of how I approached active shooters. And I ended up being unfortunately involved in active assailant events in DC, and now I help teach it, and it's one of the principles that I teach is using that experience of like acts of terrorism, whether it's from nation states or from an individual level, have been around for a long time. Yeah. And the process, like these 8 steps that people take to become a terrorist, especially if it's for a political gain, right? That's like these have been around for a while. We've been studying this, and so I really appreciate you sharing that and for teaching us that. So I'm going to get off this whole fanboy thing for a little bit, and let's get into the meat. So yeah, time to answer the real questions. Wait, hold up. I probably have a sound for this. Will this work? Like wildfire? Nope, that won't work. I was going to try to find some cool music. The intro, everybody heard that again. There we go. Questions received.
It's terrible.
Well, we're talking about CBRNe. So.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you focus more on the chemical and biological side, right?
Sure.
Okay. So in terms of recent events, because you look at this so much, are there recent events you're like, oh, that's going to change the name of the game here? Or you're like, oh, okay, this is kind of more of the standard practice for groups using these kind of weapons?
Well, I mean, do you know what? Strangely, probably the most interesting thing in terms of game changers has probably been COVID for some very strange reasons, because it's constant. Or as a constant within CBRN, one of the things you always hear people say is, yeah, we're not really investing in it right now, but just wait, we have one serious incident and everyone's going to take this seriously and it's all going to happen and we'll all start doing it. And you look back and go, well, so we had Tokyo, we had the anthrax letters, we've had, insert the hundreds of incidents occur all the time. We've had 4th generation nerve agent used to assassinate someone in the UK. If you can't sort of have that as a trigger, and indeed a sort of a global biological pandemic, as well, now we should probably take CBRN seriously. It's difficult to think what incident we would need to have that would actually cause a kind of step change. But even then, people seem to want to dilute it. So the thing about COVID, which has answered some really interesting questions, is that some countries have just said, this isn't a CBRN thing. This is a health thing. It's nothing to do with you CBRN people. Like, stay back in your cupboard. You scare us. You're all military and police, and we don't really like that. This is all about doctors and nurses. We get that, and it plays much better. And it's just going to scare people if people are wearing respirators. So you sort of saw that at the start here. No one even wanted to go to face coverings because it plays badly. Does it create panic? And this isn't people taking the situation lightly. It's them genuinely weighing up the impact of bringing these things in. But as a result, I think some countries really missed a trick in terms of, well, now hang on a second, we've trained tens of thousands of people about contamination control, about how to deal with issues in terms of outbreaks and components like that. And we just haven't really used them. some countries like Germany sort of stood up their forces a bit, but the thing that has become really obvious is that we really just didn't integrate our civilian response to these incidents, the military responses, and bio is always the one which everyone goes, yeah, it's a bit too difficult. Let's focus on the chem because it's way easier for the exercise. Small bang, deal with it, clean it up, decon it. Probably won't exercise decon because that takes too long, and we're away. You do bio, and everyone's like, well, where does it start? Oh, this is a nightmare exercise. I don't want to do this. And how many people? No way, we're not doing this. And so, if something's changed, I think genuinely speaking, the public will not allow any government to get away with not having comprehensive plans for either deliberate or natural outbreak of biological disaster going forward, because a year of global economic lockdown, I don't think anyone could have predicted quite how significant that would be. And that's with a natural outbreak, not with someone deliberately trying to cause it to happen, which could have added all sorts of additional elements into it as well. So yeah, I think that's one particular bit. I sort of hold my reservations about other things because we hear a lot of people talking about taking other aspects of CBRN more seriously. The use of agents by both sides in the Syrian war. We got all the way through to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and the UN joint reports, validating that this had happened. And the most we got, as far as we got, was a forced removal of those agents. And then when subsequent issues happen, we don't see a great deal more. And it's the classic CBRN issue. When something happens, it gets explained away as an outlier. These things don't happen very often. That was an outlier. We can't expect that to keep happening. Assassination with a nerve agent in the UK, that's an outlier. They're not going to keep doing that. Oh gosh, they did it again. Well, okay, but that really is the outlier now. That's definitely not going to happen again. It's that's an intriguing one. I think perhaps though what we have seen on that side, on the chem, is a realization that police and military need to work much more closely together. And I think we recognize the problem, but we're still not quite sure about the solution on that. Yeah, sorry, you got me on a rant there.
I love it. I think everybody's listening in saying like, okay, like this makes sense. The one sticking point I have, and we can, it'd be fun to talk about this, is I've been putting together like fun, I want to say fun, they're not fun. I've been putting together after actions, the things we already knew that we didn't know after actions. We have the most educated population in the history of the world. More people have gone to college in the history of the world, right? More people are more educated. Education has failed because you were debating the use of wearing a mask.
Yeah.
Like, are you kidding me? Or, are they putting microchips in the vials? Like, here in the U.S., as soon as the election's over, the pandemic's going to be over. Like, it's a global thing, right? And so, like, it's just been like frustrating from that standpoint. I lived in Japan in 2006. First time I went to Japan. I lived there 3 times. First time in 2006. Anytime somebody got sick, they'd put on a face mask, and they would, probably still go to work. But it was common there, and it was never shocking to me. Yep. And you fast forward. I mean, so if that was common practice then, think how long they were already doing it. Fast forward to 2020, and people are like, it takes away my freedom. That's what everybody was saying. I can't breathe with a mask on. I'm like, surgeons do this for like 20-hour days, like every day. Like, again, it's like whole education thing of like just not being able to process logically. I had somebody argue to me that it was an infringement on their right, their freedom to wear a mask. And I said, so you're hyper aware that governments are tracking you. That's what you think. I said, yes. I said, first of all, you're not that important. Second of all, a mask makes it harder. This is my mask, right? Makes it harder to see you on a video surveillance. It's actually helping your freedom if you really think about it. And obviously 6 feet apart creates a little more freedom, a little more space. So I don't know what you're talking about. Like, I just think like there's been a mass production of people trying to learn information and not being able to process information. And that's probably a whole nother topic. But in terms of the pandemic itself, it's true. Like it feels so catastrophic, and slow onset disasters in by nature are just hard for people to comprehend anyways. You're like, oh, I thought this was exploding. It is exploding, but it starts really, really small, and they don't really understand exponential growth. So that's really fascinating. You bring that up. The part about governments, the sticking point was like Texas just said here again in the United States, hey, no more mandates. It's up to personal responsibility, and I like that sentiment, but I don't think people are holding them accountable. Like you have these doctors in Texas like, wait, and that's not really going to do anything. How do we balance these extreme events with trying to get politicians to change policy?
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I mean, it's really interesting. You'd obviously expect there to be, I mean, in a country which quite rightly, enshrines the importance of individual rights as much as the United States, it isn't surprising that these sorts of arguments can arise, however nonsensical they may seem. But the fact that they've arisen in other countries where, to be honest, there isn't an enshrinement of particular individual rights like the UK. And I mean, I've gone through protests, and so I'm because it's good to have multiple jobs. So I'm a police officer as well. And I've gone through city centres where people have been saying, arrest me, I'm not wearing a mask, you've got to arrest me, because they want to make some sort of big protest about individual rights. Well, first of all, you clearly don't understand the way policing works, because we have discretion, and like, if you want to be arrested, that's probably the last thing I'm going to do. And secondly, it's, as you say, it's really strange, the dissonance in people's brains, many of whom go out and protest before this, went out and protested with masks on so that they wouldn't be recognized, and now are protesting without masks off in order to demonstrate their freedom. But equally would be pretty upset if we said, you know what, drink driving is really a matter of personal. You should be able to weave up and down a lane, knock. You're right. Hey. When we then look to, oh, sorry.
You there? Yeah, I think you cut out for a second. We're gonna have to edit that little part out. Can you repeat that last part about drunk driving?
Yeah, sure. So if we looked at drink driving and someone's individual rights to drink as much as they want and drive down the road, mowing people down, like, no one would agree that that was okay. That's clearly not acceptable. Yet when we talk about public health, all of a sudden, the individual's right trumps the rights of the group not to be infected by that person. And that's about masks. It's also about vaccination as well. And that's not unique to COVID. We've seen it in countries with the outbreak of diseases we hadn't seen for years, like measles in the UK, have pretty much been wiped out, and that's resurged again. I think it's connected to, and this is a good tip for us, I think, for CBRN incidents in the future, the Google expert. I mean, the internet's a great thing. Google's a phenomenal resource, as other search engines are available. But the one thing that has been really problematic about it is what I like to think of as the 3-click expert. So they want to know more, but they don't want to know more than a quick search and 3 clicks. So whatever they find at the top of their results and 1 click through, that's them, they're on it. And you can kind of tell them, because if you see their argument online, and you search for what they're arguing for, you'll probably find the article that they're citing straight away, because they won't have gone much further. And it's really, you even see these arguments developing where if you counter them, then they'll search a little bit further and then a little bit further. And at the heart of it, you think, gosh, if only there was like a profession where we had people keeping on top of the research and summarizing it in a publicly accessible way, and we would trust them to be able to interpret this for us rather than having to do it all ourselves.
I know, yeah.
I know. In a service-related industry, why don't we invent something like, people that focus on science, we could call them sciencers or something, or, science workers or something. I don't know, there's a catchier name perhaps, but so, yeah, I guess that's a big lesson for us in CBRN, because, the debate you can never not have about double negative, about CBRN is the how clean is clean. How do you say the disaster is over now? And that's true of all of them, CB and R. And we're sort of seeing this with people trying to come out the end of COVID. You know, how do we say it's over now? Is it an acceptable level? The problem being for us that we've always had acceptable levels of influenza deaths. So when you know, in the UK we have 20,000 people were dying of influenza each year before COVID. And people are kind of conflating that and saying, well, so when COVID gets to 20,000, is that okay for us to stop, or does it have to be zero? And everyone's a little unsure. But what we can take away from this is something that we would need to do when we're saying, well, you can reoccupy that building, it's been clean now, or you're clean now, is that people are not going to just take an expert's opinion. They might do immediately if they're feeling shocked and terrified. They may listen to the public official who's there providing help immediately. But in a more considered area, they're going to Google the work out of it, and they are going to challenge, and they're going to feel manipulated. And I'm sure pretty much all of your speakers have always said this. We probably need a lot more public affairs and communication capability than we really think it is. And it isn't just about putting like good tweets out with pictures of people handing out packets. It's about, I've heard someone use a phrase recently about weaponizing social media, which I'm not entirely sure I like the phrase, but making it much more of a two-way street. So you're engaging with the public and going, you're not just sending the information out, you're actually, it's an easy thing to say, you know, when people are trying to run social media accounts, engaging with, 100,000, 1 million people, how do you have a two-way conversation with 1 million people?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Here's like the catch-22, right? Because I just had a great conversation with Jesse Nalepa, who was the External Affairs Director for FEMA. And so I think everybody by now has hopefully listened to her episodes, so everybody should listen to her. But we were just talking about branding and consistency. And consistency in branding is very important. But sometimes the problem is, and we didn't talk about this too much, and I should probably have her back on, is like public health. What I said, what I said to her was, public health has forgotten how to interact with the public. They forgot the public piece. And so, like, here's a really example. I would always fight the term mustering in DC. We're going to do evacuations, and everyone needs to go to their mustering location. I'm working with PhDs and who are literally walking across the street thinking we're talking about the sandwich shop, muster. Like they don't understand that term. And so, like, I think we need to do a much better job of using the terminology that may be actually wrong. I know that sounds crazy, but to say, hey, this is the term you think it means, that the general public thinks it means. When I say testing, everyone's going to do their individual test. That really does mean everyone's going to do their own swab, and somebody in a lab is going to do a test, right? But if I say the students are going to collect the test, are going to collect the swabs. Collect the swabs. That's in a parent's mind. They're going to hear my student's going to go around and collect everybody else's swab. No, right? And so, like, I just had that argument recently, and that was absolutely insane that I was even trying to explain that. But like, that's like the reality of the situation. Yeah. Like when we say wear a mask, I think there might have been a better way to do it. I think there might have been a way to say, like, let's all be unified in trying to crush this epidemic that might turn into a pandemic. And if we all just like suffer for a couple weeks here and just try really hard to like put this thing on for just a couple weeks, we can probably manhandle it. In fact, I helped write the national strategy for pandemics in 2014 to 2016, and that was part of the plan of like the messaging. And when we get to 2020, it's like, oh, we're not following the plan, and the message is like, well, maybe you should do it, maybe you shouldn't. How far? It's like everyone's so focused on their lane and what they thought was right that they forgot who the audience was. And I can talk about that forever.
you bring up a load of good points there. I mean, one of the key ones in my mind that makes me think of as well, though, is kind of knowledge management. We do a lot of good work sometimes analyzing this, but our ability to remember work that we've done seems to go back about 2 years. And beyond that, we kind of forget it's been done. So interestingly, in the response in some areas in the UK, a lot of people sort of, the planning teams were brought together and they're like, okay, let's get on this. And there's a sense of urgency. We've got to get this done really quickly. So people straight away start thinking, no one's ever thought about this before. I'm going to be creating this all. I'm running on virgin snow. And partway through, in one of the planning teams I was in, someone goes, hey, there's this whole manual here about infectious disease control. Is this useful? Yeah, that's a little bit useful. What does it say? It says everyone is supposed to already have a plan in place. We can just tell them to do the plans that they're supposed to have. Wow, that does sound like it would be quite
revolutionary.
Useful. Yeah, and so I think that becomes a key issue of be good at like your knowledge management. Assume you could argue be lazy. Start off with thinking maybe someone else has already done this and be receptive to those ideas rather than seeing every opportunity in a disaster to be the person that saves the day with your own personal plan when maybe your best job is, again, to the point at the start, connecting people with the right resource. It doesn't have to be something that you invented yourself.
Yeah, definitely full circle here because that really comes down to helping you be an expert. Patrick McGinn, who I worked with on the national team now with Salvation Army, he's been on here a couple times. He loves to say, like, I don't invent anything. I just find where it's already been made and I apply it to my situation. And he comes out with these amazing products because he's able to pull in all these different resources and say, okay, this is what's most applicable, and I'm going to do that. And I think as an emergency management community, especially because the community is still fairly small, the industry is still trying to figure itself out, right? I mean, the last 20 years, it's really changed, especially with programs starting up at universities, but they're still considered professional programs. It doesn't really get into the in-depth theory or sciences behind it, and it really needs to get there. But that being said, like, I think you're right. Like, a lot of this stuff has been thought about. That's how you become an expert. That's how you look like you have the answers very quickly by not having to take the time to reinvent the wheel or be a moron and just use your own opinion, right? Like that's an opinion based. What do I say on the show all the time? An opinion based analysis is an opinion based of one, right? And so if you want to grab in information, you grab in data. Like, that's excellent. So I think there's like really good call outs to emergency managers to be like, oh, like, for example, like specifically related to this and COVID, continuity of operations plan. You shouldn't have to I mean, you could dive into each disaster type, but if you're representing a private industry, there should be an MOU in place, a memorandum of understanding with your like partners if something happens to your business in a catastrophic event. Or if the decision maker is physically unable to sign, like, I don't know, paychecks, you don't have the legal authority just to go in there and start signing paychecks, right? You need to have a document in place saying, these are the ways that we contact, the executive. The executive's unavailable. This person during this amount of time is able to represent the business and, for the best interest of the business. And that could have applied when executives possibly got COVID. Right, or decision makers got COVID. What do you do with your staff? So excellent call outs of like making it applicable to your situation.
I think that's a net benefit of hopefully that's a net benefit that we can take away from COVID of a lot of organizations that always claim they have business continuity plans, have tended to have to make them on the fly. It's way off the CBRN track, but so my wife works in IT, and obviously the moment that this happened, a lot of companies went, oh wow, employees are going to have to work from home now, so we better get them some IT. So within weeks, the global IT market was just there was nothing available, and my wife was in sort of just bewildered with people phoning her up, going, why can't they just make more computers? It's just like, well, unfortunately, the major chip manufacturer for almost all of the IT in the world is in Wuhan province. So we have a perfect storm here of the exact place where we need to get the equipment for the business continuity solutions that you didn't plan for is exactly the epicenter of this disaster. So you can't use that. And if there could ever be a better, full stop about why you don't leave your business continuity planning till just in time, it's because who could have forecast that would happen? Well, turns out it does. And actually, I think perhaps that also relates to, and again, a huge challenge for aspects of CBRN, because CBRN at its larger end, even at its smaller end, is a logistics and a mass related issue, whether it is about dealing with lots of casualties, with lots of material to remove, or to manage moving people to actually get in and remove the contamination. It's scale and logistics. And modern society is efficient. We have enough for what we need, and we have it driven by capital. We don't have spare resource hanging around, and we have a lot of interdependency. So weirdly, I think in a lot of the scrutiny of continuity plans, what we need to do is a really thorough sort of contingent checking to make sure that, well, hang on, I'm going to draw on this resource. Is anyone else going to be drawing on this resource at the same time as well? Now, weirdly, the insurance industry has always understood this, and they actually set aside, the contingent effect that, if a whole load of buildings get taken out in a windstorm or a large terrorist attack, everyone's going to be asking for building. Well, how much building capacity is there? Well, it's this much. Therefore, actually, the return to normality is going to take a lot longer than in theory, because actually 100 buildings can't be rebuilt in 3 months. It's going to be sequenced rather than parallel activity. So again, hopefully people, this sort of knock to the system will make people think that they need to look at that as well.
Okay, real talk. That reminds me of the Lords of London conversation we had in the UK. And those guys came in and talking about the math of that. And I was so pissed because I was like, these guys are having fun. I want to do this. And I was like, oh, I wish I would have known this much earlier. And since then, I've dived into a lot of those different areas, trying to do my own learning and just okay, how does this all work? And you're right, data is so critical to what we're doing. It is the next phase of emergency management and CBRN, whatever. The more situational awareness you have and are able to do predictive analysis, especially because we're starting to get into quantum physics and quantum computing with weather patterns even, and then try to figure that out. It's been really phenomenal to see okay, this isn't doomsday prepping. This is where the data is pointing, and we could potentially make curves here. I brought up another person that the number one snowplow contract in the United States is for San Francisco, because we did the math, and if we had a 9.0 in San Francisco, there would be 4 feet of glass in the street.
Wow.
How do you get first responders in there? How do you get people out over shattered glass? Hopefully it's all tempered. Probably not, right? So how do you get people out? And so you need snowplows to come in and clear that out. And so that's where data can really help us out. You keep on saying we're not talking about CBRN, but we are. I mean,
it all interlinks within it. I mean, the insurance guys, Lloyd's, and so Paul Ree as well, so the government reinsurer of terrorism, the absolutely really fascinating people. So it's a slightly different scheme in the US because you have federal reinsurance, but it's a similar concept. And weirdly, those guys will talk together. And you know what? The problems that they identify and they start looking at, are sort of the problems that we should be looking at as well. And we kind of, with most people that I've spoken to in counterterrorism, whenever I say, have you spoken to anyone in the insurance industry, they look at you like you're crazy and are like, well, why would I do that? And you sit there going, well, because they sit on billions of pounds worth of risk associated with if all this goes wrong. Their professional job, a guy called Dr. Gordon Wu, working for probably one of the largest risk modelers in the world, famously said that terrorism insurance is actually it's actually taking a gamble, a risk on the effectiveness of a country's counterterrorism capability. So you're gambling, how effective do you think it is? And so insurance companies are constantly trying to work out how good is this country at stopping acts of terrorism, and then how big will the incident be? Another really interesting example where we don't really talk much, we found years ago, we spoke to some government departments and said, so most of do you own the land that your departments are on? They're like, no, we've sold that off years ago. We went it back from a capital holdings. Oh, okay, right, sure. So that means they're probably insured. They almost certainly will have taken CBRN insurance. So if your building is actually contaminated, who do you think would be paying to clean it up? I'm like, well, it's government building, so we're clearing it up. No, they've got insurance.
Yeah.
And what we discovered was that there was a complete misunderstanding. The UK wasn't the only country that had this sort of issue with when you're coming back out of the disaster, actually how you make most effect of all the different options you've got to finance your way out of that disaster. So because an insurance company is not going to pay out if the government have already paid out. Famously in the UK, we've had incidents where the government said we're going to pay, and insurance is one of its principles. It can't enrich the person, it can only compensate them. So if you've already been compensated to the full effect of your loss, the insurance company doesn't pay out. Now they don't mind because they haven't had to pay out. But so I remember some of your colleagues on the course, some of the best things I've ever seen have been the work done to help emergency managers understand how do we finance this recovery? What are the options that we have? How do we draw in insurance? How do we draw in reimbursements through programs, through FEMA, et cetera, et cetera? You get that right, that's a really key part of it. The same thing though, and again, people may not be massively aware of it, the insurance industry tries to model these disasters because they want to try and understand how big they are. This sort of runs into perhaps one of my biggest issues with CBRN. We are way too secretive. So we make way too much too difficult to share. It is a nightmare sharing information within a country, let alone internationally, very unnecessarily. Then you look at a sister industry, HazMat, and they have no such problems. And you're like, well, it's the same thing. So, I genuinely this week, only this week I've had some.
HazMat is not, this is news to me. HazMat is not considered like a subset of like chemical. Wouldn't that be under chemical?
Depends on your country. So in the UK, we have our fire service do HazMat and they do CBRN, but the teams are different. They may be the same, or they may have personnel from the same thing, but because HazMat is seen as a definable accident. So, a lot of HazMat crews almost make a sort of thing about, well, we don't really need detection equipment because, we're just going to look at the manifest to see what's going on. That's usually people that have only just started in HazMat and then they discover people not really logging stuff properly. But it's seen as a slightly different discipline. Whereas CBRN, and this is the issue of hyper-specialism. The moment you make a dedicated CBRN team that only responds to certain CBRN incidents, they don't get to practice, they don't learn any lessons, they don't improve, their kit doesn't get properly used. And then eventually people go, why do we even have this capability? So hyper-specialism, bad thing. When we look at our health services in CBRN, in the UK, a capability was created called the Hazardous Area Response Team. And the Department of Health are a really interesting organization in the UK. Obviously, we have public healthcare. We have private healthcare as well, but we have this publicly funded healthcare. And when they looked at this from first principles, they had no legacy. We didn't have CBRN or HazMat emergency medical services before. And they went, you know what? It doesn't make sense to just have CBRN EMS. Why don't we create these teams they're the teams who are going to use for HazMat, for CBRN, for USAR, for fast water rescue, because then that team's going to be busy. They're going to have a massive training bill, but it's efficient and they're going through things. That's been going for years now, really, really, really effective. And it doesn't suffer any of the issues that other sort of CBRN capabilities have, where people go, do we really need this? Are they really very busy? Because they're always busy. And even if they haven't got anything that falls into those categories, they'll just go and do their normal EMS response anyway. So I guess that becomes the other thing for me about CBRN, is that over-specialized, underused capabilities are not capabilities at all. You've got to give them something to practice on.
So question and answer with Dr. Stephen Johnson. Beirut Explosion, CBRN or HazMat?
Oh. So I'm going to say HazMat because at its heart it was an accident rather than there being an intent behind it. But that's, when the difference between two things is intent, it's a pretty fine line. You could send the same teams to deal with the issue, but hazmat purely because of the fact that it was an accident rather than a deliberate release, in my mind.
So anytime that we're talking about CBRN, we have to think of the intent. That helps me out actually a lot, because years ago I did actually went with the NOAA liaison, Mike Paddock, Dr. Mike Paddock, who I'd love to have on the show too. You talk about two worlds colliding; it'd be really great. So we were doing DoD training on CBRNe and looking at the impact of that based off of this scenario that we were given, or we would create these scenarios, whether it was a dirty bomb in New York or a chemical agent that was in the air in another city. And so, like, what were the impact and how did we respond to that? There was not a single person with your expertise in the room, but we were truly focusing on the modeling side of getting the situational awareness out to stakeholders, right? So it was basically my job to figure out what just happened, how bad it happened, and here you go, and you can figure out what to do. And that was a really fascinating training. I want to back up here for a second, and I usually don't write down notes, but I'm having to write down notes because I'm really fascinated by this. So your background really is focusing on counterterrorism, right? And within, obviously, the intent is there. So counterterrorism. If insurance companies, who I agree with you, look at risk better than anybody else because that's where the money is saying, hey, we're looking at the level of your ability to respond to terrorist attacks. Do you think it's beholden of emergency managers from a purely financial standpoint to start studying counterterrorism? Because, for example, if an organization has a coup plan, or they install security cameras, or they install some of these things, it reduces their cost to those commercial or even residential buildings to that. So do you think that's worth a pitch for emergency managers to say, I can reduce our budget if we have these things in place?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's always controversy about the use of the term terrorism, and I think sometimes it's perhaps more useful. Again, borrowing from the insurance industry, they'll often refer to political violence. So you have a bit of a broader spectrum, and again, from the insurance perspective, they not only insure terrorism and political violence, but they insure strikes, riots, and civil commotion within there. And I think when you start to look at all those categories, you can say, well, what kind of emergency manager isn't going to look at those? Because actually, on the spectrum of political violence, there are activities that occur there that seriously impact the infrastructure of the city and the safety and well-being of the people around there. Now, how much you go into studying it is always a tough question. Back to that point, you kind of want to rely on other experts. But I think, as you kind of explained, you really need to try and understand how those incidents might affect your plans, how they may cause you to have to approach the problem in different ways, and how you're going to tie into people. Because there are all sorts of complexities that become involved when, within a natural disaster, you've got this point of, well, we're in straight away and starting to process this. However, within a terrorism event, and particularly some of the ones you've referred to, like marauding shooters, actually one of the most challenging things about it is, when does the event end? When's the point where you can start the recovery?
Well, we always talk about that. Management? We talk about that in any event, right? Hurricane happens, the hurricane's gone, we're in response. For me, the easiest one is when we stop looking for survivors. You're officially now in. There's like this thought process of like a soft recovery, where it's like this transitional period between, like, if you're not looking for live people, if you're looking either for like bodies,
you've moved phase.
Yeah, you've now moved on. But it's really hard for people to like get beyond that mindset, because they try to put everything in a box. You ask anybody in the U.S., especially at the federal level, what is a type 1, type 2, or type 3 disaster incident? Every single person will give you a different answer.
Yeah.
It's like, and so like some people will say 9/11 was not a type 1 incident because geographically it was too small. The incident was already over. But I'm like, that changed everything. That stopped the country, and then we had somebody else in a wildfire that went through a neighborhood and the wildfire was done, and that was a type 1, but I was doing like 8-hour days. It was super easy in terms of like my workload.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think we need to come up with better metrics of how to do this, and whatever industry we're in to really focus on that.
Yeah, I think it's very valid.
Also, I'm a big fan in thinking of releasing more information as well. Like, you talk to somebody and they're like, "Oh, that's top secret," or like, "Oh, that's we can't talk about that," and I'm like, "You're talking about where you're storing your water for the exercise." This is not top secret. Like, I think everyone's like, "Well, let's classify everything," and I think FEMA did a fairly smart job by making all of the national teams. They took away all their clearances and just said public trust, right? Like, share whatever information you got there. If it's really, really bad, don't share it. And I think that's kind of the name of the game here.
No, you're absolutely right on that. The I often refer to it as gatekeeping, and I'm not really sure it's always conscious, but I see it all the time with people going, "Oh, you sure we can give them that? Are we allowed to release that? Is that okay?" And sometimes that's because procedurally we've created very elaborate ways to do things. We had a big laugh about this. I've been doing work recently on the importance of live agent training for emergency responders. And so obviously I spoke to FEMA because with the Center of Domestic Preparedness, only facility in the world focused on providing a live agent training for emergency responders, which is an incredible facility. And we were having these initial talks. They were really good and opening up. We came to this point about, could you share one of those studies? Because that'd be really useful for me to share back home about why it's important to do. And we all did the same thing. We were like, okay, well, we're going to have a look at this because, releasing it. And, you're our allies, but have to check on this. And I'm like, yeah, totally understand it. I'm military, so I guess there's also that as well. And they're like, oh, gosh, yeah, it is. We had it went out to their lawyers, and the lawyers were the best people ever. They just went, you realize that this was a public document. It is on the internet. I'm like, really? Yeah. And so we were just...
okay.
An abundance of caution. I think procedure can do that. But the other aspect of it as well is to try and work out what harm do you think is going to come. So sometimes, even military is a really good example. We have to recognize that security procedures can be lax in certain areas because the value of the information is temporary. And by the time the enemy has exploited it, it isn't worth anything anymore. And wrapping ourselves up in or slowing our tempo. The same is true for these other things. I had someone try and tell me recently that I think my internet connection may have slowed down for you.
Yeah, just for a second. Yeah, you're good though. Yeah, you're back.
I had someone try and tell me recently that the drill for putting a respirator on your face is secret. I was like, well, I hope not, because there is a lot of secret material on YouTube in that case. Because again, people have they've got used to not questioning why are we doing this. So although that's a particular issue associated with security and protectively marked materials, actually it sort of goes into the same thing about, well, why do we do this way? And momentum and inertia of organizations to not change because we've always done it that way. Why do you do the radiation survey the way you do? Well, because that's the way we've always done it. Yeah, but is it the best way? Is there another way? Does anyone else do it another way? And I've seen this, probably the greatest example is in how you cut someone out or how you disrobe in a CBRN incident. Everyone has their own take on it, and in a slightly crude analogy, I once referred to it as this is a little bit like someone's sex life. So at its intrinsic level, it's the same for everyone. Okay, there are certain physics and biological aspects of it that's the same for everyone. However, no one wants to say that they're the same as anyone else. They've all got to have their own little flair, their own little sort of panache. Equally, no one wants to show other people how they do it. And when you start to draw the analogy on, you go, do you know what? This really works as an analogy because Wow, we could all get a lot better if we did find a way of sharing this information, but then no one really wants to do it. And then people are worried if they show you how they're doing it, that you might think it's not very good. If we could just get over our kind of first night nerves as CBRN to go, you know what? I'm going to show you how I take my how I derobe, how I do my decon, and have at it, rip me apart, because I would rather a friend rip me apart than a terrorist rip me apart because I haven't actually properly red teamed myself.
Leave it to the chemical biological expert to give an analogy about sex, by the way. So that's hilarious.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's a really good point of like who your friends are and that collaborative spirit and like that training ground. Like either way, it's going to happen, and you can put it in an environment where you're all working together and figure it out, or the bad guy is going to figure it out and catch you off guard.
So we train to fail. So the organization in the military that I'm currently seconded to, something called the Land Warfare Center in the UK. So we do all the collective training for land forces in the UK, the army ostensibly. And one of its key mottos is train to fail. So if we haven't found the point at which you fail, we're not pushing you hard enough. We've got to find, and you need to know, at what point can I go no further? At what point am I genuinely out of ideas, out of resources? If you just go, we just want to see if you can do this scenario, and if you do, you pass, that's all great. And this kind of goes into teaching you to suck eggs, because obviously it's your bread and butter. But what are you trying to get out of the exercise? What's the point of the exercise? Is it a confidence builder? Yay, we did it, it's all okay. Or are you genuinely trying to feel out your capability to see how good are we? What else can we deal with, and what complexity levers can we pull to make this harder for you? I've seen very few people with the CBRN exercise going, you know what, make it nighttime. We're going to do this one at night. And yet suddenly you go, well, hang on a second. Well, why would that make it so much harder? Well, let's see you do those decon drills with no light, or have you got the lighting rigs in for that? And once I've said this to you, you'll see it everywhere, especially anyone who is in CBRN. Ask yourselves the last time you did a CBRN exercise at night. Because when I went back in my mind, I couldn't think of a single time, because it's difficult, it's colder, and the chemical goes further.
That's the reality, though, right? Like that's what it would be like in the most real world scenario. 24-hour op.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with what you genuinely think the enemy are going to do. It's about testing to failure for you. It's about, well, let's find this out first, rather than waiting for it to become a threat, because it's a pretty easy thing for us to do. And even if we never do that again, well, maybe we'll learn some things which are useful for us in terms of how we improve our response to other things. So, those complexity levers about weather conditions, about daytime, nighttime, about other activities, they have a value in terms of being ready for those incidents as well. But also just the stress they put onto the system can be valuable in terms of identifying better ways to do things.
The thought process I have with training is that I've seen far too often, though, where they every single exercise needs to be, I give this scenario like nobody saw the hurricane coming, and all of a sudden we're in a Cat 5 hurricane, and what do? Go, 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 go. And it's like, that's not reality. Yeah. And so I'm actually a really big fan of, like, you're talking about building confidence. I think it's important to go through and actually walk people through the steps with SMEs in the room and say, okay, here's a scenario, this is what you do. And then after that, then you start stressing the system. You stress that more and more and more, and the frequency, right? Like after you make the basketball hoop, make the basket in the basketball hoop, like you're not over, right? You have to do it 100 more times to say like, okay, you're good at this. So a big fan of training, a big fan of the different types of training that we can provide. I'm going to Joe Hernandez was on the show. He's a urban search and rescue expert. I'm going to go to his training in Florida in May. So if you're listening to the show and you're in USAR, make sure that you check out that training. You can put something in the show notes or something. But I'm going to be going and providing the EM perspective of like what's happening behind the scenes to be able to help coordinate that. So for the people there, I'm really excited for that. But like I love the fact that they're going to have cadavers there. They're going to be testing really the system to people who have been doing this for a while, and to understand those complexities. That's really
John,
interesting about.
You have like, I can't agree with you enough about the springing the exercise on people, because that artificiality creates an exercise which people get disengaged with, because in their minds they're going, well, we would have had this would have happened, this planning would have happened. There's a phrase in the UK we taught, it's like a joke about, when you're trying to plan for something but you're in the wrong place, like, how do I get to Cardiff? Well, I wouldn't start from here. And that kind of artificiality, it creates the sort of wrong attitude. But also, it means that it's synonymous as well with the kind of recognition of the incident straight away, because maybe you don't recognize the incident straight away and it takes some time. There's a lovely technique I've seen, and it can be a bit strange. I've seen the police do it, because all incidents start with, who is the real first responder. I saw this police force did an exercise. They invited me along to and it was a counter-terrorism one to do with marauding shooter. And they had, the inspector, who would be what we call the force manager. So he's in the control room, listening to the calls, deciding what's happening, making those level of decisions. If you remember back to he's kind of like the bronze commander. And they give him an inject and say, what are you going to do now? And so the inject would start with, a car has just plowed into the side of a pub. What are you going to do now? And he goes, let's just, car has gone into the side of a pub. I know this is a counterterrorism exercise, so I'm hyper attuned for this. But what I would normally do is I'd send a car and an ambulance and a fire engine. What are you thinking I'm going to do?
Yeah.
And actually the way they did it was as he asked for expertise around the room, we had all the experts and other observers, and he could go, well, now I'm going to ask for my fire equivalent commander to come into the ops room, and that guy would go into the middle. And every time they made a decision, they're sort of sitting and looking at the exercise material. Everyone around has got like a green or a red paddle, and the exercise controller would go, okay, we're going to pause it for a moment. What do people think of the decision? Vote red or green. Brutal, absolutely brutal. But
that's brutal.
But it was a really nice way of doing it, and people would talk through, because you can imagine with that first thing, because everyone's tuned, they're like, oh no, you should be cordoning things off and getting the firearms officers. It's like, this is an RTC. Why are you getting a firearms officer to an RTC? The other nice thing about that kind of style is you progress it and you ask the expert in. What you ask them in for isn't necessarily, you suddenly learn a lot about what they can do. So you suddenly discover that actually those firearms officers, what they're going to do, they're going to hold the cordon. They aren't going to, unless there's a reason, they're not going to progressively go into that, and those nuances are really nice when you have the time to do it. Negatives, it takes time. There's a lot of people standing around, and it's a tricky thing to do. But no, you are absolutely right. You've got to be careful about just dropping the exercise straight on top of someone.
We like a phrase I like to hear is it's a funny way to say it, but don't fight the exercise. That's a really funny way to say I didn't plan very well for this exercise, or I didn't give you clear expectations. Oh, don't fight the exercise.
Suspend your disbelief for a moment. Just go with me on this.
Just go with it. Okay. Cat 5 hurricane in DC. Nobody saw it coming for 5 days. Now we're trying to figure out counterflow. Okay. That's a really good call. So I've been trying to hold back like this entire episode, but I'm going to do it now.
Do it.
Doberman Emergency Management teaches exercises, and we provide hazard vulnerability assessments, emergency operations plans, occupant emergency plans, threat hazard identification, risk assessment, COOP plans, continuity of operations plans. All of that reduces the level of complexity for you in a disaster, but it also helps with your insurances. And so we've been talking about like this for a whole time of like, how do you do that? Well, if you have Steve Johnson in the UK to help you out, then you got him. But if you're here in the States and you're looking, you're like, okay, they just had this conversation about CBRNe, or they had this conversation about COOP plans, or they had this conversation about training, and you're trying to figure out what to do, you got to hire Dublin Emergency Management Group. So I made my official pitch there. But really, Dr. Johnson, like, thank you so much for coming on the show. Like, there's just been, there's so many lessons learned. There's a reason why you're a favorite professor, and I'm sure we're going to get you back on. It might be 5-10 years from now when you have some more time, but seriously, like, it's been a real pleasure. And but before we wrap it up, I've been kind of doing this. Yeah, we've been kind of doing this thing because your field touches emergency management so much, and because you're in the military, and because you're with police, and because you're teaching, doing so many different things, a lot of accolades to your name. What would be your advice for the future emergency manager? Where do we need to go from here to be better in our field?
So, the first phrase that came straight into my mind when you asked me that question is diversity of thought and experience. And it's a very popular phrase that people talk about, Matthew Syed's book about diverse thinking. But I think given the complexity of challenges that are facing us at the moment, we need to look at how do we help the emergency manager draw on diverse experience and thinking, not just like, I want to go a fire person and a police person, but genuinely challenging that, because for so many emergency managers, they are the lone wolf. They're the single person in the department, and again, they're perhaps in an organization with quite straight thinking. And they're focused around a certain way. How to do that? Well, it's about engaging with communities and with organizations and businesses that you may not even associate with emergency management. They may not associate themselves with emergency management, and take that opportunity to say to them, look, I'd be interested to see what you would do in this situation. Because the nice buyout of that as well is that actually, because everyone ultimately tends to be involved in an emergency, the more people that you've asked and consulted on about how things are done, then the better your plan is going to end up being. But, so I guess that line in there is try and find the organization or the people or the person that no one would ask, and ask that person what they think, and draw them into the conversation. And I think that's a useful thing anyway for organizations, that we need to draw on that experience so that the plan that we're writing is a plan that works for the whole community as well.
I love that. We're doing in California, we have to do these PSPS plans, public safety power shutoff plans, because the utility company essentially said we're going to be doing rolling power outs for power outages for a long time. And so we're actually going in, we have contracts right now where we're going in with PSPS plans. And I think what has shocked most of our clients, or pretty much everybody we've talked to, is the amount of involvement we want with stakeholders. And we just ask more and more organizations of, how do you touch this community, right? Whether it's a county, or we're working with a tribal nation, the Kashaya Band of Pueblo Indians. Big shout out to them. We're big fans of them and what they're trying to do. But whatever their constraints are, we're trying to figure out who every single person who would touch this event if an event happened to them. Yeah. And I think that's how you get away from cookie cutter. I love the idea of try to ask the organization nobody would think it, because everybody's going to be involved, and everyone's going to do something. Whether you involve them or not, they are going to act, right? Yeah. Schools are reopening right now, despite guidance, right? They're going to figure out a way, and for the testing, for example. So really good call out.
You take those organizations, particularly the ones we never ask. Take those organizations that are politically lobbying for the rights of their group, and say, you know what, we probably don't consider you guys well enough in this. So leverage the fact that they are organizing themselves to try and determine what they need and better in a political sphere, and say, well, while you're at it, we'd like to know how we can do these things better as well, because ultimately that's how you dismantle these concepts of unintentional but institutional biases, because you work out what's wrong about it. The Canadians did a great exercise years ago where they realized there was a problem. The problem is, how are we going to deal with emergencies where we've got a lot of people who are disabled and need a lot of extra care? Guess who they didn't ask? They didn't ask the disabled people in the exercise. And eventually one of the ladies in the exercise, and the Canadians were very honest about it, they wrote a great paper out the back of it. One of these women just said, for all that is holy, can you please get this idiot to stop pushing my chair? Because every time we go over a curb, I think I'm going to go flying. I can get down this curb safer than he can push me. Just let me go. And they were like, you know what? Maybe the person that knows how to evacuate themselves is the person who has been living in that wheelchair. They may be more able than we think.
I bet the
So there we go.
Canadians were very apologetic too when that happened.
Oh, hey.
Sorry. So it's so easy to offend the Canadians because they're so nice about it. So
They'll be fine.
yeah, they'll be all right. They're good people. So okay, Dr. Johnson, again, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks,
You're welcome. If you like this episode, which you should have because it was phenomenal, you should give it a 5-star rating and subscribe. And of course, we always get a ton of people sending us messages to info@dobermanemg.com, and we do appreciate that. Keep sending those emails. However, our main page for the podcast is Disaster Tough Podcast on Instagram. We also post on LinkedIn and Facebook about it. Again, Disaster Tough Podcast. So reach out to us there. If you want a question to ask the community, just like what Dr. Johnson was talking about, ask a question there. We can respond. We'll be posting more about his background and questions there, so that'd be great. Tune in for next week. Thanks.